Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And in the case of some of our panelists, good morning again tomorrow. I am Pete Ogden. I'm the Vice President for Climate Environment at the UN Foundation, and really pleased to be here today to be co-hosting with the Secretary General's Climate Action Team and the Technical Secretariat of the High-Level Expert Group to this session on the stock-taking session of their net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities group, often shorthanded as HLEG, as I'm sure we will many times use that today. We will get to an update on this much anticipated work as we run in the run up here to the COP, and I know we're all very much excited to see about the product of all of this incredible amount of work that you all put into this. Today, we're going to be able to get some updates from the group about where the work stands, some of the key findings and lessons that they've learned from all of this public outreach that they've done, and then a little bit of some updates on the outreach process, as well as some milestones that are upcoming. We also will be able to take Q&A. We've a little bit of that. We've gotten a lot of questions in the context of the registration process, and please also continue to make use of the chat function to add those questions. The teams here will be taking note of those and trying to get to as many as we possibly can, and in any case, using those to inform the work as it goes forward. So that is very useful. And we have a great set of speakers today. In the interest of time, I'm going to introduce them kind of as they come up. And to begin that process will be the chair of the whole enterprise, Catherine McKenna, who you all know as for her tremendous climate leadership when she was the Canadian Minister for Climate Change and the Environment, as well as during her time as infrastructure chair, the Minister for Infrastructure and Communities for the Canadian government. So with that short introduction, Catherine, over to you. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks very much, Pete, and hello, world. I don't know who's joining, but I know there's certainly a lot of interest in the terribly named HLEG, which is really a group of experts. I feel very fortunate to be working with an amazing group of 16 independent experts. You're going to see 3 of them today, 3 amazing women, Kahori, Janine, and Mary, but it's a really great group that's very diverse, and the Secretary General clearly put a lot of thought in making sure there's representation from around the world, gender balanced, how great is that? But also just real experts. Look, why are we doing this? I think the Secretary General, he doesn't mince his words. As he said, pledging net zero is the easy part. Doing the work to get there is much harder. And in good news, we've seen, I think about 90%, 80 to 90% of the world's GDP is covered by net zero pledges. We know that we need to meet global net zero by 2050 in order to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. And we've already seen the terrible impacts every single day when it comes to climate change. I mean, the images that we saw in Pakistan, recent extreme hurricanes, which are made much worse because of climate change, extreme heat that we've seen across the world. In China, lakes literally drying up. So we clearly have a lot of work to do to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And non-state actors, which is the focus of our group, businesses, investors, cities, and regions play a really critical part. But we need the work to be done. It's easy to make a pledge, and actually the worst thing would be thinking we can all just wait until 2050 before acting. And so our group is really working hard to make sure that work is being done, and that we're making sure that we have standards and criteria that are clear, that we have transparent plans, and that actions are implemented in full. The Secretary General said, with respect to net zero pledges, we have a deficit of credibility and of concrete delivery plans and a surplus of confusion about the many various types of pledges that have been made and what they mean in practice. And I think we see that by folks who are like, wait a minute, everyone's saying net zero, but why do we continue to burn fossil fuels? Why is money not going at scale to developing countries? Why do we feel like we're not going in the right direction? And that's really the focus of this group. Our recommendations really are aimed at bringing more clarity in the space of net zero commitments. And this will be, the report will be presented to the Secretary General in the lead up of COP27. So obviously coming up very quickly. Transparency, inclusiveness of our process is extraordinarily important, and you will hear more about that coming up next. Back to you, Pete.
Thank you very much for kicking this off. And as you indicated, we're going to get to hear next a little bit more about what of an update on HLEG's processes and consultation processes that you have all been intensively engaged in from Janine Felsen, who is a fellow at the University of Melbourne. She's focusing now on integrated solutions to climate, oceans, sustainable development. Previously, you know her as a senior diplomat, government of Belize. She served in a number of roles there as an ambassador to the UN, legal counsel to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And today we're lucky to have her to give us a short update on the HLEG consultation process. So Janine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pete. And I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
So yes, I will give you a brief overview of the work plan and the process that we've been engaged in. So the high-level expert group has built on the terms of reference that was set for the group. And based on that, we agreed to a work plan and that has a two-phase approach. We've worked on 4 themes included in the terms of reference, namely 1.5 degrees, so focusing on standards and definitions of net zero. We've looked at short-term interim targets, transition plans, measurement and reporting, so focusing on credibility criteria in that regard. The third theme that we've focused on relating to governance of targets. We've addressed the issues around verification and transparency. And then in relation to pathway to regulation, we've been looking at standards and criteria. So we started our work as a group in around late March, and we're now in the final stretch of phase 2. In phase 1, we went through a process of mapping and analyzing the net zero landscape. For example, by looking at having a range of one-on-one consultations with key stakeholders to help understand where some of the major initiatives are in their net zero journey. And now phase 2 consists of drafting recommendations which follow the vision of the Secretary General and aim to ensure credibility and environmental integrity in non-state actor net zero emissions commitments. The group has also agreed to implement a comprehensive outreach and engagement plan. The purpose of these consultations is to help gather the widest possible range of inputs and perspectives to underpin the group's work in developing stronger and clearer standards for net zero emissions pledges by non-state entities, including businesses, investors, cities, and regions, and speed up their implementation. We had an open call for submissions through a dedicated portal for 2 months over the summer from the 29th of June to the 31st of August. Written submissions have been a key means of gathering information and perspectives, building understanding and helping advance the work of the group in an open, transparent, and inclusive manner. We've received close to 300 written submissions from interested organizations, initiatives, and individuals. Despite the tight timeline, the group has convened a wide range of stakeholders, including through a business and finance roundtable, which was held in August, and a global public session convened with the UN Foundation in June. We've also briefed the UN Secretary General in person, as well as UN member states. In addition, members of the group have held over 40 regional and thematic consultations with participation of more than 500 organizations across the world. And you will hear a little bit more about this from my fellow panelists, who will elaborate on some of the takeaways from those meetings. On top of these, in our independent and expert capacity, members of the group have participated in a variety of events, including at Climate Week in New York. So I'll leave it at that, Pete, and turn the floor back over to you. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you very much. And I am pleased to be able to introduce our next speaker, who will talk and share some of the insights that she gleaned in the course of this consultation process. Mary Nichols, who now is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy, and previously was chaired the California Air Resources Board, where she really blazed the trail for climate action at the subnational level in the United States. And that work that she did there really remains the North Star for subnational action in the US. So really delighted to have her here and to hear what she has learned from this process, a person who knows so much, but I guess got a chance to learn a few things too. So Mary, love to hear.
How many hours do we have, Pete? There were a lot of hours of consultations and a lot of really interesting and impressive people who took the time to brief us at our various meetings, as well as submitting written materials. I want to say at the outset, I've looked at the questions that were coming in while we've been online here. And the people who are asking these questions are obviously very knowledgeable about what else is going on at the moment. So, you know, one of the things I do want to say is that we realize that we're not the only entity that is advising the UN about these issues, and we've tried not to take over anybody else's turf, and to be respectful of all of the other processes that are going on at the moment, while at the same time recognizing that our group has a unique vision and a mission, which was given to us by the Secretary General to address this issue of how to make the net zero commitments real, and specifically how to address the issue that we've all become very aware of, that there's a sense that net zero could be used as an excuse to, in fact, go on with business as usual and see no real progress made towards the goals that are still far in the future, and where we see that there's a need to begin action now or earlier. So one of the big questions, one of the big issues that we will be addressing is this question of how do we get any net zero pledgers, and we want to see people making pledges, but then we want to see them beginning work right away. And so we're looking at how to incentivize, or just how to direct that happen. What we can say that could make it clear that we believe that net zero can't just wait until some endpoint. There has to be planning and targets and measurable targets along the way. We also feel that finding ways to discourage continued investments in the most dangerous kinds of greenhouse gas emitting activities, particularly burning of coal and oil and gas, is in direct conflict with where we're trying to go. And so we have to find ways to make sure that there's a switch, a real transition, and perhaps not least, given the breadth of the group and its experiences, that the transition, the term just transition, be not just a term, but be incorporated within any plans for net zero. We've also heard concerns about the lobbying that is going on, even on the part of organizations that have made net zero pledges, to prevent further action, positive action by governments, and to slow down any movement in the direction of mandates. And this is something that we also have to take into account. And also the issue of accountability on the part of net zero pledgers. Again, finding ways to make the actions that are taken not only visible and transparent, but also to recognize the need for some accountability on the part of board members. So these are things that we have heard. We've also heard a lot of concerns on the part of those entities that are engaged in actions, voluntary actions to reduce their own emissions, about wanting to see support for that kind of activity, and how to do that consistent with all the other other concerns that we have is a part of what we have to wrestle with in our final set of recommendations.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That clearly you got a really rich opportunities for engagement around this process. So that's really interesting to hear the takeaways from the North America sort of side, and transitions as well to Miyoki Kahori, or Kahori Miyoki, who is the co-chair of Japan's Climate Leadership Partnership, which is a coalition of more than 200 businesses advancing decarbonization efforts in Japan. And she's also the general manager of ESG strategy and solutions department at the Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Bank. And she has been doing consultations also here in Japan, in the Oceania region broadly. And so I'd love to turn it over to you now, Kahori, to share a little bit about what you've gathered in that process.
Thank you, Pete. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and I would like to share some of my takeaways from the consultations in Japan. We held a virtual regional consultation in August with 206 people from 145 organizations from public, business, and nonprofit sector joined the session, with a particularly high number of participants from the business sector. I was quite surprised of the high attendance, which shows a keen interest in the topic, especially from the business side people, as we did have quite a number of opinions and questions raised during the session. I'd like to share three main areas of concern raised at these sessions, which will be the following. First is the complexity of the area of various standards. For instance, the emission calculation rules specified under the Japanese energy reduction law are actually different from GHG protocol. This itself may be a Japanese specific issue, but in the area of global initiatives, similar thing is happening with Race to Zero, SBTI, and GFANS, and so on. So there were a lot of voices asking for a better alignment or simplicity on this. Second is the level of stringency and leniency of standards. As much as we all appreciate the urgency of the climate risk, when it comes to the reality, especially for businesses, some people felt that if they were too stringent, it would be an overburden to companies, especially the smaller companies, which may discourage positive voluntary actions. Participants of the consultations have suggested that it would be they would like to see striking a balance between the stringent and leniency would be great. Third point was around scope 3. The need to reduce scope 3 emissions seems to be consensus, and nobody explicitly questioned that itself. However, the lack of data and calculation methods for scope 3 emission was raised as a problem that companies are struggling with at the moment. So standards or regulations, whichever it is, should be something that encourages them to continue tackling scope 3 and make a steady progress rather than punishing them for not doing it perfectly at this point. These were some examples expressed at the consultation I held, which again came out because I think it shows how much a lot of Japanese corporations are indeed taking this seriously and try to comply and do their part of the journey of tackling climate crisis. But at the same time, I did hear a lot of confusion and concerns towards the lack of guidance, especially when it comes to the actual task of tasks. For example, setting company targets, the periods, or whether it's going to be short or medium long-term investment policies, how it should be laid out, and the reporting and so forth. So as far as stated at the beginning, other members of the group also did many consultations to reach out to various stakeholders. And we did receive so much feedbacks and comments throughout the world. In addition to what I heard from my consultation in Japan, I think a couple keywords was in the area of offsets and credits, coal phase outs, carbon pricing were commonly heard from different parties. A lot of concerns over the use of offset was heard, but at the same time, there were a lot of discussions about making sure we encourage companies to mobilize private investments to fund things like nature-based projects. But we definitely needed to be clear. We needed to clarify more about the urgency and the priority to reduce the absolute emissions first for all non-state actors. We did have some worried voices about not being able to close the gap that we currently have. But overall, the tone, I was more encouraged by the enthusiasm and welcoming voices about towards a clearer standards for all non-state actors so that they can make the step forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And you touched actually at the end on a number of themes that I think we'll get to pick up again in the Q&A session that we're going to move into here. And which will be joined in that session by Anne-Sophie Cerisola, who is the director for the Secretary General's Climate Action Team. And we've received, as I mentioned at the outset, a number of questions, both in the chat, thank you for that, and also in the course of the registration process. And so we've tried to attempt to answer as many as we can and draw together some of the themes. I'm going to sort of create some composites here, but I will start with the first one for Catherine, because I think that in addition to the processes here, people have been asking about, what are the other kind of thematic areas that you think are going to be addressed or have been particularly relevant to the discussions that you're working on. So, for example, matters related to phase out of fossil fuels and elements that create credibility around a net zero pledge. I saw your Project Syndicate piece recently, which I think touches on a little bit of this, but what do you see as the kind of major, some of the major themes that you think are going to be addressed here?
Well, thanks very much, Pete. And just to step back. So first of all, thanks for all the questions. Lots of really great questions in the chat. And I think some people are like, wait a minute, like, let's step back and try to explain what we're doing here. As Mary, Kahori, and Janine have mentioned, like, there are a lot of different initiatives going on. I think the idea is that the HLEG is above that. And I don't mean above that, except that the Secretary General is the Secretary General, and he can actually sort of say, like, what are the standards and criteria up here that then when you have voluntary initiatives, that really there's clarity about, what is required at the highest level. Clearly, we can't get into all the detail that would be required and that you see through different initiatives, but there are some pretty basic things. I'm a plain spoken person, and we have a very practical group. So I think when you step back and you think, okay, well, why do people think there's greenwashing? And a lot of people don't know exactly scope 3. They've never heard of HLEG. They, are just trying to figure out what's going on. And why are they seeing all these terrible impacts of climate change while at the same time everyone's like, we're so ambitious. So there's a disconnect. Clearly the use of fossil fuels. Let's just be clear, 80%, of climate change is a result, including of historical use of fossil fuels. So you would be remiss if you don't, we would be remiss, and we've got a group that includes scientists and all sorts of folks, if you did not say something about that. I think that there's just the standards and criteria that you need to be clear on what is required. You can't just have a 2050 target and wait till 2049 to do the work. I say that to my kids with their homework. You're not going to get an A just because you say you want to get an A. You gotta every day do the hard work. So really looking at having things like interim targets. We've heard a lot of comments about that. A lot of comments about the rigor that's needed and the detail, because it's not just saying you have an interim target, it's actually showing how are your emissions going down? How is the money you're investing going from dirty to clean? Then there are things that are just inconsistencies. And I will say this, in my own previous role, I was minister. Folks would be like, yeah, we're super all in on the climate projects. We're really wanting to do things. And then they go down the hall to the Minister of Finance and they're like, no way, don't do that. That's all terrible. And so that's bad for two reasons. One, it's disingenuous, and that's just bad, that we all should be straight up. But two, there's the ability to have an ambition loop. And that's what we really need. I saw that in Canada. When we landed carbon pricing, it was because we were able to get businesses to say, actually, we need a price on pollution. And that made a huge difference. We always need environmentalists, but you also need business. So I think it's the things that actually, if you're just a regular person, you would say, okay, that there's a disconnect. How do we make this real? But we're very aware that there are, when we say non-state actors, that's like a lot of folks. That's everything from a large financial institution or a multinational, where I think there are real concerns around greenwashing, although also some really amazing work that's going on that makes a real difference through the supply chain. But then there's cities and regions, and then there's very big cities, and then there's very small ones in the in less developed countries and developed countries. There's SMEs. And the good news is, we have Kahori here. She understands the Japanese business community. We also have Camilla, she's she talks about small business, medium-sized businesses in Colombia. So I think the task is very large. So we're trying to be practical. We're also trying to very specifically deal with greenwashing, but recognizing that there's a capacity issue when you talk about smaller actors. There's a difference between cities and regions and multinationals. But I think you will see a level of clarity that I really do hope people appreciate. And I also hope that they appreciate the time that has been put in, all volunteer in independent capacities of our amazing group of experts who really represent the whole world. And often I am part of these things and the whole world is not represented. So I think that perspective is really important.
Thank you very much. And I think one of the themes that you picked up on is one that I will turn to Janine next and ask her about, which is in that effort to, as Catherine referred to increase accountability. That's obviously one of the major tools here that hopefully this report will, as Secretary General has talked about, could be a tool in that arsenal to improve accountability. Janine, you've worked at the national level, international level extensively, and I'm interested in hearing, and as are a number of other people who've been writing in, about how you see subnational accountability as a kind of distinct effort. What things have you learned about how to drive, how to help build support for that kind of necessary transparency, both not just at the federal level where there's a lot of work and we all see how that plays out in the COP process and all those things, but what have you seen here and learned in the process of your HLEG prime?
I think it's clear, and Catherine just mentioned that you have a range of actors that are very keen on making a contribution to what is a critical endeavor for the world to ensure that we are able to secure 1.5. And it isn't even securing 1.5, it's ensuring that we don't breach the long-term temperature goal on 1.5. So that broad range of actors, not only business, but also subnational entities from cities to local communities, they too are part of this conversation, and that's been clear. I think what's relevant in our discussion here as a high-level expert group looking towards standards and criteria to address how best these subnationals can be engaged. It means that the way we present our recommendations will necessarily have to take into account what they can contribute and how standards and criteria can specifically speak to their contributions in our efforts towards net zero. So I think that's something that the group has been very thoughtful of and very careful in considering the appropriate way in which recommendations can address and support subnationals in engaging in net zero commitments and pursuing them. What's critical is that these have to be operationalized. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that segues actually nicely into a question that had come for you, Kahori, specifically. I'll flip you and Mary here in the sequence because it sort of bridges. The question is an observation and a question, which is that subnational authorities have been actively engaged. Or excuse me, I'm sorry. This is the Kahori one. We've received several questions on the role of governments in the oversight of net zero commitments. And you can see in the chat, several people also raised the question of the appropriate role of regulation, how governments can do more to coax this action. Do you find, or what have you found the most effective ways to accelerate that governments can use their tools to accelerate non-state actor decarbonization efforts? Either through setting mandatory requirements, or you discussed it, some of the nuances around that, Kahori, but what is the appropriate role for the federal governments to become partners here with subnationals in these efforts?
Thank you, Pete. Yes, we did discuss extensively about that part. And being as a part of the Japanese business community, there's a lot of different opinions, controversial, about how much the government should put it in the mandatory. For example, in Japan, there's a lot of discussion about carbon pricing at the moment, and there's a lot of pros and cons, of course, but I think from the business community, I think people were more, most of the people wanted to have a more stringent mandatory requirements, because it makes things a little bit simpler, because they, voluntary is important, but there's certainly it gets to only a certain point with voluntary actions. And at the last moment, if you want every single person to be on board, it has to be mandatory. So I think there are more stronger voices towards a need for a asking for a little bit more mandatory regulations. But at the same time, it's very difficult for the government to, because a lot of heavy industries and all that. So, and the community that I'm talking to is a more leading company, so they wanted more mandatory to take a place.
Maybe I could
That's
just
my
add
addition.
to
Yes,
that.
Catherine.
And thanks very much, Kahori, because that's something we heard loud and clear, that we need to move from voluntary initiatives where there's different degrees of stringency. And of course, we're going to try to address that. But also enforcement is very challenging, verification and enforcement. And the best way to be able to enforce is if everyone's required. And by that, I really mean starting with the large corporates, the large emitters, if they're actually required to have to take the action. And we've seen actually really good movement. The Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosure started off as a voluntary initiative, and now it's moving into the mandatory space. So I think there's been a lot of good work, but that is something that is part of our, Janine mentioned, that's part of the mandate explicitly to look at how to move to regulation.
That's great, thank you. And I wanted to ask Mary sort of the flip question, which is, what do you do when you have strong subnational ambition, but you don't have a federal government, a federal authority to create that uniformity and the coherence of national policy, and or even to that can be so helpful, right, in creating the circumstances, the broader environment in which subnational action can be taken. You know, how can people, you know, who might not see their own ambitions reflected in their national governments yet be real engines of change subnationally?
Sure. You know, when California started on our mandatory cap and trade program at the state level, it was with the hope and the belief that in doing this, we would be pushing our national government towards a national climate legislation. And there was a very strong effort in that direction that passed the House of Representatives, but then was never even taken up in the Senate. And the politics of, I think, most countries have not favored, getting strong national action, which is one of the reasons why we see a proliferation of subnational entities adopting programs. And in turn, that is one factor, along with, as Catherine mentioned, many companies that actually understand and feel the need to have a stronger approach towards dealing with the climate crisis, that we have this proliferation of different programs going on. I think a lot of the pressure to have more coherent and more unified standards and regulations is coming from the subnationals and the business community themselves, because people see that even with a great desire and some resources to put into it, we're still not getting the results that we would like to have. So all of this to me is somewhat like the bubbling going on of a pot, which is going to eventually lead to something happening, and hopefully that will be in the direction of moving us towards regulation at the national level, and the UN itself can help to encourage that. One of the things, Catherine mentioned it, but I want to also highlight it, is that particularly from the cities and states that we spoke with in every continent, there's a very strong desire for technical assistance in developing their programs. It's one thing to say net zero or to talk about scope 3 in kind of general terms. It's really something else to try to actually do it. And although we have not specifically, I know somebody asked this question, at least as of yet, come up with a role for the UN in this, I think it's clear that there's a real demand for some greater pool of expertise that can be made available on an implementation level, regardless of the kind of general principles that we come up with.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary. The last question I have here is for Sophie, and it's a sort of forward-looking question, which is about what are the next milestones for HLEG? What do we look for, and when do we look for it? Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Pete. Hi, everyone, and hi, HLEG ladies. Always a pleasure to share a screen with you. Look, it is pretty straightforward. This group, as you have heard, is hard at work on finishing the report and the recommendations for the Secretary General. The Secretary General really wanted to have these recommendations before COP27, a little before, to have some time to read them. And really also, I think he wants to do also out of respect for the work being done by the group, to have a public response also to the proposals that will be made by this group. You've heard him many times. He has very strong views on what climate ambition means, what kind of accountability is needed. So I think he's very keen to read these recommendations on all this range of issues. And he will speak about it probably at COP. We are still in the process, and we're speaking with Catherine in the group of organizing an event, but we foresee and we think it would be helpful for everyone to have a public event at the beginning of COP and strive to have something hybrid because it would be important to, but I think the ESG is very keen to speak publicly, not only, by the way, about the recommendations, but in general, where we stand, where do non-state actors stand in terms of their alignment with 1.5, in terms of short-term actions. And I believe the ESG also really wants to insist, not only with non-state actors, by the way, but also with government, on the huge work that needs to be done before 2030 to accelerate action. So this is very clear in his mind, including on issues of decarbonization and fossil fuel. And then after the COP, there's a lot of things that will need to be done within the UN, within the UNFCCC. I don't want to speak for the UNFCCC, but you know that there is a new executive secretary. And I'm sure once the COP is passed, because this is a big thing to deliver, but I'm sure he's thinking already about next step next year. So this is not a discussion that will stop on October 30th or 31st. I forgot how many months we have in October.
Thank you, Sophie. And actually, we're running out of our time here, and I wanted to just give you a chance also to make any sort of final reflections or offer any final reflections or remarks here at the close.
I think I'd be happy to do that, unless there is really, if you see a pressing question for Catherine or any of the panelists, because they are way more interesting than I am, to be honest.
I can't choose among my children here. There are too many. So let's, I think it's probably, given the time, best to just hear from you, and then we can continue this discussion, encourage further outreach and engagement in this as we reach the home stretch.
Listen, no, I just wanted to thank you, and it's great to see so much interest on this issue, because at the end of the day, and this is what you heard from Catherine, from Janine, from Mary, it's a collective intelligence work. I know that they heard a lot during the consultations. We got a lot of submissions, and what we heard and what we read has been extremely helpful. Of course, they have a very difficult task, because as they have all said, and I think this is something that the ESG, who met the entire group, in New York in September was really impressed, and it's the first comment that he did afterwards, by the diversity of the group, by this mix, because even at the UN, it doesn't happen that often. I shouldn't say that, but I note that, you know, even when UN bodies try, it's not always that diverse. So that is very good. I think the added value of that group also was well signaled, coming from different horizons and proposing different ideas and having a keen eye for the issues of capacity building in particular, because we all know that a lot of this work on net zero pledges, etc., has been done in Europe, in North America, in the UK, in Japan, but there are, you know, entire continents and sub-regions where it is starting. They will need a lot of support. We have members from Africa in the group, from Latin America, and they have very specific ideas on how this could be done. And we strongly believe that this will be an added value of the group. So a lot more to discuss, but let me thank you all. Like I said, we're not going to stop there. The SG is not going to stop there. And we'll be counting also on all of you after the COP to help us move forward with the implementation of these recommendations. Merci.
Thank you so much. And thanks really to everybody today, everyone who's participated. I really appreciate how really transparent and inclusive this whole high-level expert group process has been, and everyone taking this time in their mornings and nights to join us today. This event has been recorded and will be on the high-level expert group website, as well as on the UN Foundation's YouTube channel. And so with that, I will just thank everybody and look forward to the product of all this tremendous work. So thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.